Hi, this is Jeff White at Versatile Fighting Arts and Life and Living Now. And I wanted to make this video to go with the writings that I sent out the other day. And this is something that is really close to my heart because I see where, in reading posts online and obviously things in the news, people get focused and centered on what they're against. And it's for good reasons. And many times they feel like they're being proactive, they're working against something and making their voice heard. And I understand that and I applaud that. Everybody has freedom of speech. Um, but I've noticed through the years that there is a difference when you are for something and when you're against something. You actually have more power, more fortitude, more creative ability when you're for something rather than when you're against it. So I wanted to call our attention to that. Oftentimes I see people making posts, and sometimes there's little jabs and memes that come out, and we have all done that, and some of us do it more than others. But it's seldom presenting what you're for, and usually it's against, in various states of misinformation or disinformation, which I do also think hurts your personal sense of integrity. But in this case, people are sending things out. My issue is that where's that energy come from and how does that energy play back in? So let's kind of look at that. So I entitled this The Power of Affirmative Focus, why being for is stronger than being against. And so there can be a subtle yet definitive difference between two individuals who deeply care about the same cause. They both can be intelligent, they both can be informed, and they both can be moral. One spends their energy and their time fighting what they oppose, and in doing so, they feel like they're being effective and providing for a solution. The other person invests their energy in building what they want to see. Both may be passionate. This is key. Both may be passionate, and it can indeed at times be equally right in their opinions. However, when we dig deeper into the psychological and the philosophical underpinnings, we find that they are quite different in their motivations and what fuels those visions and drives. So this is the principle behind the thought process. Focusing on what you are for is far more powerful and more beneficial than focusing on what you're against. Now, this principle shows up in our relationships, it shows up in politics, it shows up in business and mental health, it even shows up in our identity. There are those who make counter that if one engages in such a principle, they're naively ignoring the problems, kind of a Pollyanna kind of attitude. However, this isn't true. It is more about where clarity, energy, and lasting change actually originates and where all that lasting energy comes from. If you're against something, then that thought process is more reactive. It's defined by something else. It's defined by another force. It's defined by another person, defined by another system. It only exists in relation to something else. If you take away that obstacle, then you take away the enemy. The against identity has nothing left to define itself. Whereas being for something is generative in nature. It seeks to create, not just react. It has not just its own shape, its own idea and direction. Whatever you are for is independent of any opponent. You can build towards it even if there's no opposition. That's key. That's crucial. When the focus shifts towards what you oppose, in other words, when you shift your mindset and you start looking at what you are against, then your cognitive orientation becomes reactive, is bound to and by that very framework that was the person sought to resist. And as humans, we operate heavily on selective intention. It's how we are designed. We're able and do regularly select what we want to pay attention to, excuse me, to what we will focus on and where we'll invest our attention. When we focus on the negative, then the mental image is that which we want to fight. And our brains work off of images. So that when we imagine the thing that we are against, such as anti stress, anti corruption, anti poverty, for example, which are all very noble ideas in the positive, but cause our mental apparatus to continuously engage in and with negative targets. The image we create and hold in our minds with emotional content is negative, so we create more negativity. Pro affirmative goals, such as cultivating peace, building wealth, fostering integrity, enable and prime the brain to notice opportunities and generate positive pathways to a desired end. So, resistance based focus triggers the fight or flight aspect of our sympathetic nervous system. It sends a signal to the body and to the mind that we're in danger. The impact on our nervous system generates a chronic low level anxiety that persists even when we're no longer thinking about the issue, eventually creating a sense of chronic fatigue that drains us of energy and mental bandwidth. So you wonder, if you're always kind of focused on a negative, or you're always paying attention to the negative things that are happening in the world and taking that in, you start getting tired of it all. You have this sense of low level fatigue and anxiety. And this is why. Instead, focused on the positive. Okay. Um, so when we focus on the goal that's directed on positive thoughts and goals, so then we engage in dopamine-driven reward pathways. So the mind and the body are set out to reward positive focus, which enables a sustainable long-term endurance and elevates a sense of creativity. Within groups or within organizations, the ones that focus on and are defined by shared opposition. In other words, when you have a group and their entire reason for being is against someone or something else, then they're defined by just that sense of shared opposition. Quite often they fracture and they disperse once the threat diminishes. There's no reason for them to be there. Their entire identity and goal were dependent on something or someone else. Groups that are built upon shared positive vision instead build a sense of resilience, constructive organizations that will outlast the immediate conflict. These groups operate by principle and vision rather than disdain. And it's an important distinction to make, I think, in our thought process. So when you focus on what you're for, you are creating, which is far more powerful and beneficial than the energy involved in negation. When your mindset is attenuated towards the positive and what you are for, it tends to produce greater resilience, greater creativity, and greater long term success. Consider the difference between two mindsets. One is a person who is against failure and one who is for success. The person who is against failure will act and, more importantly, will orient their thoughts to be focused on avoiding mistakes. Their focus and mental image are on possible mistakes. That's the image they have in their mind. While the individual who is success minded is typically more focused on growth, more focused on learning, more focused on improvement. That mental image is success. Then now, psychologists have long known and understood that attention influences perception. This is critical to understand. Our brains are continually filtering vast amounts of information, and then prioritize what appears to be important based upon off the desired focus and assumed beliefs. So when an individual becomes fixated on what they oppose, the brain constantly scans the environment for threats and for obstacles, and more importantly, evidence of the unwanted conditions. These are important consequential differences. There are important consequential differences in between I don't want to fail and I want to succeed. Although at first they do seem similar. One focuses attention on failure, so the mind presents more failure and may even self sabotage. And the other is focused on success, giving the mind images of success. It's not magical thinking, it's pragmatic reality of cognition. What receives attention also receives mental resources. So, where do you want your resources to go? Now, as we look at this topic, let's also understand that we came by our negative bias quite naturally. Humans evolved with a negative bias as it serves us well in keeping us out of trouble or alerting us to danger. From a survival perspective, noticing danger was much more important than appreciating opportunity. As a result, the brain naturally pays more attention and gives more weight in our attention focus on threats rather than positive possibilities. When people constantly focus on what they're against, they activate stress related responses. Possible and typical reactions are anxiety, hypervigilance, defensiveness, fear based decision making. In contrast, in focusing on desired outcomes, one encourages creativity, curiosity, confidence, problem solving. Which would you prefer? Research into positive psychology suggests that positive emotional states are able to broaden thinking skills and increase mental flexibility, which allows individuals to discover greater solutions, greater opportunities. Now, psychologists also look at this in terms of approach motivation and avoidance motivation. Approach motivation deals with moving towards a desired income or desired outcome, and avoidance obviously deals with moving away from a feared or a disliked outcome. Decades of research continuously point to approach oriented goals tend to produce a greater sustained effort, more creativity, and this is important to me, more satisfaction than avoidance based orientation. And now, avoidance goals keep the nervous system kind of engaged, as we mentioned, this low grade sense of vigilance and otherwise also anxiety. Your mind is constantly scanning the world, the environment, the news for the thing that you do not want. Your attention is chronically tied to the very thing that you want to avoid and resist and be rid of. The very thing you wanted to escape is exactly what you'll find more of. Approach goals instead leads you to direct your attention to the target that you're building by focusing on the positive. You tend to produce more and you produce more flow in your activities, more intrinsic reward, less anxiety. That's brilliant. This is why I don't want to be poor is far weaker driver than I want to build financial independence. Though they appear similar and may produce behaviors that appear similar at the start, the motivating fuel and the signals it sends to the brain on what to look for are vastly, vastly different. One keeps your mind circling around the idea of poverty, and the other fuels your mind with something to create and construct. Now, here's where it gets really interesting and even more important in my mind. What you repeatedly focus on becomes part of your self concept, part of your identity, part of how you label yourself. Your self concept is the total overall mental picture and collection of the beliefs that you have about yourself. It includes your labels. It includes identity, includes traits, abilities, lack of abilities, social roles. It answers the fundamental question of who am I? The answer, your self concept, changes over time based upon your mental and emotional evolution, your life experiences, and personal reflection. If what you digest daily is your mental rehearsal of what you think is wrong with the world, a relationship, a business, your life, etc., you shape your internal identity and organize it around resistance. If you allow your identity to be fixated on resistance, eventually it can crowd out the positive. This matters as identity is one of the strongest predictors of sustained behavior. People do not maintain habits because of willpower alone, but rather because the habit matches who they believe they are. That's critical because the concept that we have of ourselves, our identity, is how we have formed our beliefs in the world around us, and it's how we're going to respond to everything. Okay. So, for a thing that orientation gives you, an identity that you can have and grow into. So, when you are for a thing, then that orientation will also give you an identity that you can have and you can grow into. Whereas an against mentality gives you an orientation that not only gives you an orientation that only survives as long as the opposition remains. So, my apologies for stumbling over that and reading my notes. So, when you are for a thing, that orientation gives you an identity that you can inhabit and grow into. Whereas whereas an against mentality gives you an orientation that only survives as long as the opposition remains. Now, some will argue that an against mindset was necessary in order to tear down something that was unwanted. But what do you do with it once it's gone? There isn't a plan to build something good in its place. What did you become in the process? Those are the things you want to look at. Let's be more skillful in how we look at ourselves, how we look at the world, and let's set all of us for better things. Now, often uh, when we try not to think of something, we actually cause our minds to present us with that which we do not want to think about. Now, at times, this is called ironic process theory. Telling yourself not to think about a mistake organizes your mental energy and imagery around the image that you didn't want to consider. All right. The mind works off of images, and the negative image is the one that you're engaging in, even though you don't want to. So in doing so, you end up keeping the unwanted thoughts centered directly in your mental field. Defining yourself by clear positive ideals, ideas, and beliefs helps to sidestep this trap. You're not suppressing a thought or image, rather you're redirecting it to a much more powerful image. Sustained anger, resentment, and opposition, even when it seems the underlying cause is just, results in a measurable toll that's taken on your life. Chronic activation of stress related responses are all linked to elevated cortisol levels, disrupted sleep cycles, and diminished capacity for creative problem solving. Now, this doesn't mean that I think anger is never appropriate. There are times when righteous anger can be legitimate and even useful. The issue is when opposition becomes permanent or enduring operating mode, rather than just being a spark that motivates one to a more constructive action. Clear eyes, critique is important. So a clear-eyed critique is important and necessary, but it's often a first step. It's not a sustained state of mind. In other words, so something may happen, and we may have anger, and preferably more of a righteous anger. The difference for me is more righteous anger is things that you see that are not affecting you, but affects others, and you see it as injustice. But if you stay there in the negative and just resist, you tear yourself down. You're not as productive. Once you see where there's a need, refocus, rechannel, come up with what you're for. What is it that you want to build from this? And then go about building that. That keeps you more on the healthy side of things, healthier mentally. Okay. So that's why I said a clear-eyed critique is important and often necessary. Okay. Many historical movements began in the rush of anger at real or perceived injustices. A healthy pattern could be to let as you mentioned, the against mentality recognize and name the problem, and the for mentality then comes in, takes over, clarifies, and devises a proper solution or direction. The trouble comes when a person or an organization stays stuck in opposition. When stuck in against mode, one gets stuck in the problem, and the psychological costs then accrue and accumulate without the offsetting benefit of forward motivation. So, by focusing on the positive and on what you want to build or create and what you are for, it gives you a compass rather than a fence. Opposition and reactionary responses tells you where the edges are, but doesn't tell you where to walk, only where you don't want to go. A for orientation supplies direction. Does this move me forward in the direction of attainment of my goal or vision? If your motivation depends on the persistence of an enemy or even the existence, small victories may feel hollow, as the problems can still exist and large defeats can be crushing because you feel like you haven't done any good. But if your motivation is about building something positive or what you are for, then progress is measured by your own output. And that's something that you can control. So, where do you want to live? Do you want to live in the against, or do you want to live in the for mindset? I would encourage you to look at your thoughts and what upsets you. Are you stuck in opposition, or can you move into for or building solving mode? And who do you want to be? How do you want to live? Do you want to live in anger or in peace? So, some things to think about. I appreciate it. Have a good day. I would love to hear your thoughts. If you'd like to email me at lifeandlivingnow@gmail.com, or if you're seeing this on the Versatile Fighting Arts side, versatilefightingarts@gmail. Thank you.